Hello my bookish friends out there in booktube land, and welcome to this episode of Tristan and the Classics, where we are going to have a mini masterclass in literature focusing on a unique narrative technique in novels which changed storytelling for good. It is free indirect speech, or free indirect discourse as some call it. So from classic literature all the way to modern literature, free indirect speech has allowed authors to get into much closer contact with their characters. It's allowed them to dive deeper into the minds of their characters, to pick up every sense and vibration from within them so that the reader can experience the world from their eyes, through their senses. And if you want to understand literature, or you want to be a better writer, it's pretty vital that you understand the narrative technique that is called free indirect speech. So, what is it, and how did it change literature, and how is it used? That's what we're discussing in this video. So, without further ado, let's dig in, shall we? So first of all, let's have a definition of what free indirect speech actually means. I'll put it on the screen. Free indirect speech is a narrative technique that blends third-person narration with a character's inner thoughts or speech. And that allows the reader to experience the character's perspective without explicit attribution. Did you get that? Free indirect speech allows a third-person narrator. Now, there are numerous ones of those, but for simplicity's sake, let's just say the author's basic narration. They're just describing the world, they're describing who did what, who said what to each other. But free indirect speech allows them to blur that narration with the inner thoughts and the phrases of particular characters. And that allows you as a reader to get a little bit closer to feeling and experiencing what the character feels. To understand free indirect speech even better, consider what storytelling was like before it was widely used. You had two main kinds of narrative: direct speech and indirect speech. So direct speech is when the words are vocalized and explicitly attributed to the speaker. So, "I'm going to the shops," said Mary. Do you see the "said Mary" at the end? We've been given her phrase and then we're told exactly who says it. Direct speech. Indirect speech, we don't necessarily hear Mary say the words. It could be related to us. So Mary said she was going to the shops. That's indirect speech. Now, while direct and indirect speech have an advantage of making everything in a story quite clear, you know exactly what's going on, what it doesn't do is it doesn't let you inhabit the character. There is a distance brought between the activity, the character, and the reader. Free indirect speech gets around that. The only other way to get around it without free indirect speech would be through the first person narrative. Because if you've got a narrator who's telling you the story as themselves, then they can tell you what they were thinking and what they were saying and doing. That's a way to do it. But in the third person, you need free and indirect speech if you want to get into the character, to get your readers close to feeling the world as the character feels it and sees it. If you're enjoying this video, could I ask you to hit the like button, because 70% of viewers don't do it, and yet it takes a second to do and makes a huge difference to me this side of the screen doing the work. Anyway, back to our video. Now enter Jane Austen, sometimes called the Queen of Indirect Free Speech. She is a master at character insight and perspective, because she starts using indirect free speech so that she can have a narration going on and then slip into the minds and perspectives of her characters without breaking the flow of writing with jarring "she said" or she thought to herself, or having to use quotation marks. It made her writing fluid and effortless and allowed the reader to think, let's take one of the characters, Lizzie Bennet, think Lizzie Bennet's thoughts as if they were their own. So it gets the reader from just having a description to coming down into the world and walking in the shoes of the characters. So I'll put a quote on screen from Pride and Prejudice, which is an example of free indirect speech doing this. Elizabeth was determined. She could not see what motive Mr. Darcy could have for acting in this way, and she had long since ceased to respect him. So did you see from that quote that it was narration, but we were getting Liz's thoughts, Liz's perspectives. The way she thought and felt was tainting the way the narration was written. And it brought us closer to her as a reader. It helped us to actually inhabit her mind and automatically gain the agitation that she's got. How could Mr. Darcy have a motive for doing this? I've ceased to regard him anyway. We get the how she feels. She ceases to have any regard for him. We know how she feels. She just almost despises the man. And it's all done without interrupting the flow. She's got rid of she thought, she said, which would jar, which would give us an accurate description as though looking at a painting, as opposed to virtual reality where we can get into the painting and look around. Now, Jane Austen wasn't the only one to do this, but she was amongst the pioneers, another one being Goethe. But later writers like Virginia Woolf and George Eliot and Gustave Flaubert experimented with free and direct speech and evolved it further to get a better blending of narration with character, so that the experience of reading was very, very deep. In fact, I think the German term for free and direct speech roughly translates to experienced narration. So as if the narrator can experience the feelings of the characters and portray them. I think that's a great way of thinking about it. But when is free and direct speech superior? That's what we're going to look at next. So why is free and direct speech more superior than other narrative styles in certain situations? Well, it's because it allows you to get more intimate with the characters. It allows for subtlety. Just the choice of words helps you to really understand what the character's thinking. One of the things this can give is it lends itself to irony, which is something Jane Austen was brilliant at. Now, irony, of course, there could be a whole video about that. Irony is when someone says one thing and means another, sarcasm being its lowest form, or when someone thinks one thing but you, the reader, know otherwise. That's like situational irony. So in the book Emma by Jane Austen, if you've read it, you'll know that there's an account where Emma is trying to matchmake the clergyman, Mr. Alton, with her friend, Harriet. But Mr. Alton likes Emma, and Emma hasn't twigged. Now just look at this line. She was quite convinced of Mr. Alton's feelings. It was too plain to be mistaken. Now, did you notice how there was a blend between Emma's voice and the narration? It's funny for us as readers because we know Mr. Alton likes Emma. But the things he's been saying as overtures, Emma has misconstrued as if he's talking about her friend Harriet, and she thinks her matchmaking is going to plan. But the way the narration goes, it's clearly how Emma feels about it. She talks about it was too plain to be mistaken how Mr. Alton felt. And so we are left to judge the irony. We are left to find out or to conclude just from the sentence, wow, she's got that wrong. And it makes it really funny. It also sets us up for the later perturbedness of Emma when what she thought was too plain to be mistaken was in fact mistaken. And that's brought about by the free and direct speech of the way Emma's words taint the narration. Another way that free and direct speech really comes alive and is useful to the author is when you want to have the character's perspective, the character's inner world, but maintain a distance from them as the narrator. Free indirect speech comes in handy there, and a good example would be Mrs. Dalloway herself in the book Mrs. Dalloway by Virginia Woolf. Lots of the narration is tainted by her thoughts, but there's a distance held. So here's an illustration, a comparison that you can do to demonstrate the difference between direct speech, indirect speech, and free indirect speech. And what we're going to do, we're going to take a look at Mr. Brown. He's at an event where he's feeling left out. Now, how would you go about describing it? We'll use 3 examples. Direct speech would say, "I feel out of place," thought Mr. Brown. Indirect speech, Mr. Brown felt that he was out of place. Free indirect speech, of course, they wouldn't even notice him. He could leave and it would be like he was never there. Now, do you see the superiority of free indirect speech in that sentence? We're left to feel the isolation, to feel the rejection, to feel the duck out of water sensations that Mr. Brown has about being in this place. He's very insecure. And it's an unfiltered emotion. It's accurate from his perspective, but it's not messed up by breaking in with he thought, he said, which would... We're still distant from him in this, but that would make us just be looking at a picture and not feeling what he's feeling. We just get an accurate description. When you get the direct and indirect, they're accurate, but we're so far away we can't become emotionally invested in Mr. Brown. That's the real significance of free indirect speech when it's used well. Let's just look at 2 more from classic literature, starting with a line from Virginia Woolf's To the Lighthouse. She felt somehow very beautiful that morning, her arms bare and her hair tied up loosely. And why shouldn't she? It was her house after all. Now that line is about Mrs. Ramsay in the book, and in it we get to not just get a description of her, but we get to sense her feeling of vanity, her sense of self-importance. You know, the vanity, she felt beautiful that morning, her hair loosely tied up. Now that's description and narrative, but then why shouldn't she? It was her house after all. You can tell that those are thoughts from Mrs. Ramsay, but we don't have to have a formal declaration that this is an explanation, that this is Mrs. Ramsay thought, why shouldn't I feel this way? Instead, we have this fluid feeling, and we unknowingly have gone into the mind or the soul or body of Mrs. Ramsay and are looking out through her eyes. Here's another one from Gustave Flaubert. This one is from Madame Bovary. She was to be pitied. She was so weak, and yet how captivating she was. Now that was about Emma Bovary herself, the main character in the book. Did you get her own sense of self-pity and self-absorption and importance? You know, she says, oh, she must be pitied, she was so weak. She's talking, the narrator's saying that, but who really is saying it? Emma Bovary's own thoughts and words have mingled with the narrator. And, you know, she was captivating. So that's how she feels about herself in the context of what's being said. All without breaking the narrative flow. And it just allows us to enter the world. It allows us not only to have the story described, but to literally begin to feel what Emma Bovary thinks of herself. Another very important way that free indirect speech can be used, and this time so subtly that many readers don't even notice it, which is brilliant because you get the emotional reaction not knowing how it's been achieved, and if you're a writer you want to learn to do this well, is in describing a scene. So I'll give you an example on screen of how this can be done wrong and how it can be done right. Just before we give it, here's the scene. Let's say we're talking about the 1870s, 1880s, and some common working class man who's never left his street in his life has gone in to meet the boss of the factory, and he gets ushered into the room. The boss is smoking, and we get this line. The ash hung from the cigar like a snowy cornice from a jutting ledge of an alpine mountain waiting to fall. Now, that would be narrative. But the illusion, the illustration, the imagery is very much the author's. Because think about this. Would the man who lives in the 1870s, is working class, would he have ever gone to the Alps? Would he know what it's like to see one of those great cornices of snow just dangling ready to drop? No. So although it's descriptive of the ash hanging off the cigar, that's not the thoughts of the working class man who's gone in. However, try this. The ash hung off the cigar like the drooping branches on the tree outside his auntie's house. Now do you see free indirect speech? How does the narrator know about our man's auntie? Not part of the story. This is clearly a relation of ideas by the man himself. And the effect is really potent when you're reading a scene, because you've gone in probably feeling nerves because he's meeting the boss, and now everything he sees is being filtered through his mind and his experience in life. Do you see what free indirect speech does? I'll just put another one on the scene. Let's see what you can tell about the character who says this in a description. Inside, the decor was terrible. The chairs most certainly didn't go with the table. And the colours that made up the rug were those that no person of real taste would ever have agreed to. Now, I've narrated a scene for you. But is it truly the narrator that's speaking? Because it's not an impartial description. This is subjective. I am passing judgment on whether the combination of chairs and table work together, the decency or the classiness of the rug itself. Clearly, this description has been blended with the thoughts of some maybe hoity-toity above themselves character. Maybe it's a person who is visiting a poor relation who doesn't have money and is just looking at how they've done their house out. Do you see how you've got an emotion in a description because of free indirect speech? The words have led you to see the scene from a particular person's point of view. And that is free indirect speech. If you enjoy literature and want to explore it even further with me as I learn more about it myself, consider joining my Patreon community. The link is down below. We read a classic book every month, and I provide a video doing a review on it and some videos discussing other aspects of literature as well. Anyway, back to the video. From classics all the way to the most modern novel that's about to be released tomorrow, I hope you can see why free indirect speech is so ubiquitous. It's because it allows you to enter the rich inner lives of characters in all scenes, potentially to see it from a person who is standing there and thus experience it for yourself. It gives you access to the inner emotions of a character. It can highlight unspoken dilemmas of characters. And, by the way, for another video, it's a chief element in creating an unreliable narrator. So next time you're reading a book, whether it's classic or modern, look out for where the characters' emotions and thoughts begin to blend with the actual third-person narrator's voice. And then you'll be beholding free indirect speech.